this picture, and I chose this one because I like the idea of an empty table, and we gather around that table and we bring our intellectual merchandise to be shared, and we'll probably fill up this table by the end of the semester, or the end of the year. I'll give you a brief overview of some of the books that I'll be following. I'll try to be very brief, but just to give you a little bit of context. The Liber de Cucina is the first cookery manual known in Italy. It dates to the early 14th century, and it was prepared for the court of Naples. Some people think Palermo. It's in Latin, and all the other books that you see here are sort of derivations of this book. Obviously, there were no copyrights back then, so these were notes that cooks would take and then share among themselves. So they would add something, correct something, translate it in different languages. In this case, the Tuscan language, Venetian vernacular, and so forth. But most of the manuscripts of this era are related to each other. It's one big family of cookbooks that were meant for the upper classes. Obviously, the upper classes because they were for literacy issues, but also because they were the only ones who could actually decide what they wanted to eat, as opposed to figuring out what to eat today, if I eat anything. The next book where all these manuscripts sort of converge is this Libro de Arte Culinaria. The title is in Latin, but the book is in Italian vernacular, by Maestro Martino da Como. We'll see a lot of recipes by him. He was probably from northern Italy, near Como. The manuscript is dated to, or at least the original manuscript is dated to 1465. The Pierpont Library owns one of the manuscripts. One is in Riva del Garda, on Garda. The other one is in the Vatican Library. This is considered the first modern cookery book, mainly because it is the first time where there's more attention for proportions, cooking times. There is a table of content, or rather, there is a division or a subdivision of the contents into meats, vegetables, legumes, seafood, and so forth. So there's the idea of a book rather than notes taken in the kitchen with greasy hands. This is the one that is this in front of Paul. This is the newest translation for California University Press, with a very interesting introduction. The other important name that I'd like to bring up, although I will not refer to him specifically during the talk, is Bartolomeo Sacchi. He was a humanist known by Platina, who basically steals 240 out of 250 recipes from Maestro Martino, translate them into Latin, and tries to put them, you see, of honest pleasure and good health, and tries to put them in a context of a pseudo-scientific context, in pseudo-scientific description. It was the first attempt, really, to bring food and culinary art from gluttony to a form of art with scientific implications. Obviously, it's done, for a number of reasons. One of them was, to advance his career. This is where Platina, in a very famous painting by Melozzo da Forlì, is invested as the prefect of the Vatican Library by Pope Pius VI. So he became very, very famous. He had a very adventurous life, not all made of success. So this is what he does, provides this pseudo-scientific context to the Liber de Arte Culinaria. The book had major successes, and some of the immediate translations in Italian, French, German, and so forth. Pay attention to the dates. It's the 1500s. Italy's Renaissance is really the cultural center of the Western world. So Italian cuisine travels thanks to this books and other books around Europe, and becomes the model for the entire continent. Again, for the upper classes. Bartolomeo Scapi is the author of the book that I was trying to get you to see online. This is considered the most important or the most accomplished cookbook of the Renaissance. So we can refer to this one. There's many more. I have a list of them just to give you a sense of how many of these books were produced at the time. The importance of this book, or of the work that Scapi did, is in his really encyclopedic knowledge of food, where to get it, when to cook it. And that was not limited to Italy. It was not limited to Rome, where he was active as private cook of the Pope, but he had a very broad understanding of food, especially for the times. And he didn't travel. Can you guess how he got this expansive knowledge of things that he had never seen? Not through books.
Through immigrants?
You're close.
Or traveling monastics?
Yes. Through the conclaves he attended.
Oh.
Because that's where all the cardinals coming from everywhere would gather and be locked in for several days or weeks, and they would bring with them their private cooks who would hang out in the kitchen and share recipes, spy on each other, exchange information. That's where probably, or most of his knowledge about food comes from, which is basically what we're doing here. We're locked up for a couple of hours in this room.
Every week.
Yeah, we could call it this the conclave.
I can.
Has to be the
Huh?
conclave.
Good job. You have to be good at puns.
Notice how dignified his portrait is. Books at this time, cookery books, have become really beautiful objects, and they are presented in a very dignified way, starting from the picture of the author. It's not with a wet, dirty apron, but it looks like an author. It could be a philosopher, it could be a scientist of any sort. And you will see this, or you would see this, in every. You would see this in any book published during the 15th century, or the 16th or the 17th century. This is a list, just to give you an idea of how popular the art of cooking had become. Published in Venice, Ferrara, Venice again. Venice is very frequent because it was a publishing hub, especially for unconventional things. But these are all related to, yes?
Why was it popular for unconventional things?
Because it was far enough from Rome, basically, and the papacy.
Okay.
At this point, are people reading more? Is this getting out of...
This is still meant for professionals. But don't forget, Italy was not a nation. There were dozens of city-states. Each one of these city-states had its own nobility. So there were a lot of courts, and therefore a lot of cooks who would cook for these aristocrats, basically. So that's where the conversation happened, where the market for these books happened. Okay. Now we are in the world of printed books with Platina's translation of Maestro Martino's book is the first cookery book ever printed. So the dynamics are slightly different from when we were talking about manuscripts before.
And was Venice also, in terms of access to ingredients, was it different from elsewhere in the country because of being an endpoint on the Silk Road or, other things?
Well, it was a port city.
Yeah.
So that's but that's the printing that happened in Venice,
Yeah.
not necessarily the cooking. Venice, for instance, became one of the most important, you probably read this, hubs for sugar refineries or refining sugar, or for producing those huge statues made with sugar that were used to decorate the tables. It's basically because there was a lot of traffic there. Just like today, Trieste is a major center for coffee roasting. Illy Cafe that you probably see around here, but there's no coffee to be produced in Trieste. It's just all because of the trade that happened there. More books in the 17th century. I'm not going to touch upon these because this is probably the century when, from the apex of Bartolomeo Scappi's opera, the Italian cuisine starts to plateau and then to decline slightly. What happens in the 17th century is mostly a reproduction of what Scappi had already achieved. Nothing really surpasses Scappi's work. And that's a transition point towards the 18th century when there is a major transformation in Western cuisine. Do you want to read the recipe to begin with? 2% peacocks in all their plumage, which though cooked appear alive, spouting fire from their beaks. The peacock is skinned, making sure that all the feathers stay attached to the skin in one piece. It's gutted, stuffed with good things, covered in spices, roasted, then put on a metal contraption in such a way that the bird stays up, as if it were alive, and then it's dressed back on with its skin and all the plumages. Obviously, all the plumage, the tail is opened for display. Sometimes it's covered in gold plate, or gold leaf, I should say, and then they put a piece of cloth or cotton in its mouth with grappa, probably aquavite or some other alcohol thing, and it's lit. So when it's brought at the dining or at the banquet, it really looks regal. So this is the pièce de résistance of the banquet. What does this make you think of? Why would they do this? What's the purpose of such a elaborate preparation?
Makes me think of the theater.
It is
And
very
drama.
theatrical, yes. It's a display of opulence, basically, not only for the bird, for its beauty, for the gold and the spices that go on it, for the time it takes to produce it. Really, cuisine, or the concept of the banquet, was associated with this theatrical, almost a form of intimidation towards the guest. See how rich and powerful I am. And you are my guests. I sit above you. Maybe there are very important guests sitting next to me. The others are sitting in a hierarchical order. So the most distant from the head of the table is the least important. But most importantly is the display of money, of power through financial means. So the banquet is not really about eating, forget it. You'll see some menus with hundreds of dishes being served. It's not about nourishment. It's not even about enjoyment or gluttony. It's really about social power, political implications, and literally intimidation of the guests. Sometimes the dishes of the banquet would be paraded through the main square of the city, so the poor, starving people could eat them and feel even more subjugated to their administrators or lords or whatever, whoever was preparing this banquet. Now, if you find that this is how can I put it, excessive. And,
I do it all the time. It's
Very moderate.
Yeah.
and the
Well,
Italians,
Kasuma's coming for dinner,
and the
right?
Italians were
That's like his
totally crazy barbarians. Look at this. This is a manuscript dating basically from the same times as Maestro Martino's, in which exactly the same recipe in a shorter version is reproduced in Great Britain. Obviously, these recipes, as I said, we're attributing it to Maestro Martino, but they had been around through that manuscript tradition for a long time. Sorry?
And I'm having fun reading the recipes.
Yeah.
So even in Great Britain, the Italian model had been adopted, and it was obviously this was not the only recipe. I'm going to show you another
Where are you
one.
getting all these peacocks from?
They were raised evidently in the hunting reservations of these palaces or the gardens. The more exotic, the more rich you appeared, obviously.
Do you know anything about the flavor of a peacock?
No, I've never tried.
Like chicken?
I've never tried.
A turkey, maybe, yeah.
Wild turkey, probably.
Yeah, yeah.
Which tastes
Yeah,
very
that's
good.
our beautiful turkeys, Route 66.
I thought this would be another interesting recipe, just to show you to what extent they would go. This is what Martino calls a fluttering pie. It's basically a crust with nothing in it. That at the moment it's brought to the table, it's stuffed with live birds. So when the pie is cut open, the birds fly out. And everybody is surprised,
Orange, white,
amused,
blackbirds.
entertained
That's a
by
baked
this
Oh, that's baked.
apparatus.
So how
Maybe
did they
they were
get the
underbaked.
birds in the pie?
They made a hole underneath.
Oh, underneath.
So they made
Yeah.
a crust, they
Made a
baked the crust.
Yeah.
Then just before entering the banquet, they would put the birds in, and then the show would happen. Now, aside from the imagination, the creativity that goes into this process, what I'm interested in is the fact that it's not about the food. It's actually a pie that doesn't exist. It's about the entertainment. It's about the success of the meal as opposed to the actual appetite to be satisfied.
That's interesting that they have you fill the crust with flour, I guess for the shape while it's baking.
Just
and
to share and then empty.
Yeah.
In this version, there is a little pie, the hole is plugged with a smaller pie. Just to make sure that if anybody, but I don't know about the seasonings of that pie with birds inside, rather nervous.
Scared birds, yeah, right.
Earlier versions don't have the little pie inside.
Then you have to catch the bird.
Poop squad.
Then you have to catch the bird. Now I'm going to show you a clip.
There you go, Andy. Next president's.
Yeah.
President's
Trustee.
Yeah, I think you can take some cues from this.
I'm going to show you a clip. Are you familiar with that show that was on the air a few, maybe 10 years ago, The Tudors? It was a Showtime production.
Wouldn't this be a very loud pie? Or
But the banquet was not
Right.
quiet,
Yeah.
in general, you see.
Just like here.
Oh, I should, there is no sound here, right?
Yeah, let's see if we can.
Yeah, but I'm not connected. Well, I'll just, it should, the speaker from the computer should surface.
It's not?
Oh, it's not on the screen?
No.
If you go to the PowerPoint and hit
Let me see if I
escape,
can-
sometimes you have to hit like end slide.
Oh, just a good point.
And then,
Get out of the power.
yeah.
Do you see it?
Yeah.
Not moving yet. Resume.
The round button. It's like one person.
Who had time to eat? Who had time to eat?
Entertainment.
So this is Henry VIII and Francis II, King of France, at a meeting at the Field of the Golden Cloth that actually took place.
I think you turned the sound off.
You're blocking the screen.
Anyway,
That's fine.
we're getting started.
We just have to be quiet.
Should I go back? This way again?
You embarrass me, brother. And all I can give you in return is this pastry.
Oh.
Oh.
So the writers of this show obviously did their research. This is both recipes of Martino, the stuffed bird with the plumage on, and the fluttering pie. Let me see how I can stop this now, or maybe close it altogether.
I know, it's just like,
Maybe it's
that was the
dark.
technology, I think.
I wonder if the production team actually made that pie, or if that was, you know, a prop.
Whether it was
Don't have
real
an
food or
answer for
not, is
that.
that what you're asking?
Yeah.
I think it was probably Play-Doh or something.
Yeah, probably.
Paper mache.
But what's, it's extremely realistic what they did in this scene. Both the entertainment during the banquet with the sword fight, and then the pie. But what I'm interested in is how the gift exchange works, because on one side we have jewels, and on the other side we have an empty pie, and that was as valuable, as precious as those jewels that were being offered. Okay, so it was not really about the monetary value, but about the creativity of those who provided the entertainment. There was a term to, and there is a term to indicate this kind of entertainment, and in Latin it was artificium, artifice, basically, where art or the ability of the cooks and the steward, really the head of the household staff, were praised for their ability to create these things. This is actually a painting of this meeting between Henry VIII and Francis I in France, and this is how the production of Showtime, the Tudors, reproduced that painting. So artificio, or artifice, was achieved in a number of different ways. Meals were served buffet style, so people would be sitting around a table or multiple tables if there were, many guests. And all the food would be piled up at the center of the table in a buffet style. There would be as many tablecloths as services were being served that day. So the banquet, the first service would be a cold service, what they called servizio di credenza. Credenza is a term that we still use today to indicate a piece of furniture, which is a piece of furniture where the cold food would be placed, like a sideboard, would be placed before being put on the table. If you want, I can tell you also why that name.
Sure.
So credenza comes from credere, Italian, to believe, to trust. So that's where traditionally the food would transit before being served to the Lord, and the office of the credenza, that is the tasting of the food, would be done before serving it to the master of the house and the rest of the guests. So the taster would actually test the credibility, the reliability of the food. And that was the piece of furniture where that happened. Obviously, we don't do that anymore.
Was
that-
Go ahead.
I was just saying, was that because you're worried about poisoning?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
But not flavor?
Not really flavor. It was poisoning, but up to a certain point, then it became a ritual more than anything else.
I had the same question.
Yeah.
How do you get that job?
It's a dangerous job.
Yeah, were you
That's
paid a
your
lot,
life.
or were you just not, or did you just despise? Yeah.
So the number of services was usually an odd number. They would alternate cold services. So the hot service, you probably know better than I do, would make it from the kitchens while the guests bless you, while the guests were being entertained by the cold food, and there was this constant alternation between the two, up to 7 usually. So the first tablecloth would be removed with the first service, and you had a clean tablecloth. Then the second would go, the third would go, and so forth. So the display of abundance, obviously, because by piling up all the food by buffet style, everybody would see everything. A grand entrance, imagine the peacock being brought on the shoulders of 2, valets, possibly with music accompanying it. And then there was, an army of people working in the kitchen, in the dining room, although there were not really dining rooms, but in the hall where the banquet was taking place. Just to give you an idea, Scappi had about 100 people working in the kitchen for him. And they were very well organized, like literally militaristic structure. One of the top jobs was the carver. It was the guy who would, because the roasts and everything else would be brought whole at the table for display, obviously, and then it had to be carved and served. And this was like a ritual, like a, part of this theatrical representation. There are books entirely dedicated to the art of carving, or sections in cookery manuals about the art of carving, which was highly prized. It was a combination of fencing and anatomy at the same time. They were usually people of coming from noble families. They were perfectly dressed. Even the position in which the left foot would be forward, they would pick up, say, a bird with one fork, lift it in the air so that everybody could see it, and slice in the air, make sure that the pieces would fall on the plate. With the tip of the knife, they would pick up some salt, sprinkle it on it, and have it go around the table. So it was really complicated to do. And there was a lot of knowledge that went into it. This is our tables showing some of the hundreds of different knives and tools that they would use. To the point that they would tell you the alloy that you should use to make a fork as opposed to a knife, because the fork has to be softer than the knife, because when the blade hits the fork, it would go dull if the metal of the fork is too hard. Other forms of artifice, coloring, they would use spices, saffron for gold, for instance. There was a whole school about making aspects of different colors with natural, not always natural, mostly natural coloring agents. White would be considered a color of purity, so there were dishes that were made entirely with white ingredients, from fish, white fish to chicken breasts, sugar. All ingredients were white. One more, the ability to produce fake food. So you were thinking of eating something, but it was actually something else. So playing with shape and texture of food. In this case, these are some examples of food that were served. Do you have a question? Foods that were served on lean days. Half of the days were lean days, according to the liturgical calendar. So if you couldn't have butter, cheese, or eggs, they would use mostly almond paste. Almond paste was, it was a white dough that could be shaped and colored however you wanted. Yes?
I guess I was interested in like the theater of who gets to reach first for food, and was there like a process around that about who gets to eat? Is there food left over for those of us at the sad end of the table?
There is. I mean, we're talking about massive amounts of food. Probably 1% or less of the food was actually consumed. The only difference between where you're sitting is that the centerpiece would be at the center or closer to the guest of honor, and the smaller dishes might be closer to the periphery. So not everybody had access to everything. Okay, so that's the main difference. Other ways to display opulence, exotic meats and seafood. Imagine seafood, if you lived more than 10 kilometers, or say even 10 miles from the coast, it was very difficult to transport. So you had to have horses, people changing the horses, ice, and so forth. Fruit, gold for covering some of the dishes, and spices, obviously. Stuffing and layering. All the idea of stuffed food comes from this display of opulence. Not only I'm eating pasta, but I'm stuffing it with meat. I'm having a pie, and this is this high. I'm having, lasagna is made with layers, and there is condiment between the layers. So the stuffing and the layering was another way to display this opulence. Imagine the name tortelli or tortellini comes from torta, because they are small torts that are cooked individually or prepared individually. See this recipe from the Liber de Cucina, so the first cookbook. These are the ingredients for a torta parmesana, so from the area of Parma. Dismembered chickens, onions, lard, spices, salt, saffron, bone marrow, parsley, fresh herbs, fresh cheese, eggs, almonds, sugar, prosciutto crudo, sausage, pork, giblets, and dates. There was no distinction between salty and sweet. Everything went together, and the sweet flavor started at the beginning and ended at the very end. Okay? Because spices were one of the displays of opulence, and sugar was the most expensive spice of all. Plus it was white. Or the whiter it was, the more pure and valuable it was. This is the actual, yes, sugar. This is the actual recipe. It's in Italian, but I thought I should show you. For solaio they mean layer. So the way the recipe is described is by first layer, second layer, third layer, fourth layer, fifth layer, sixth layer. So they were very careful at creating the effect that when you cut a wedge out, just like a cheesecake, you will see all these layers and amplify the pleasure and the display of opulence. But what did it taste like? I mean, we can remember in one of the first meetings the idea of cooking a medieval Renaissance dinner came up, and I said, you don't want to do that because it's very different from what we eat, and that's what I find interesting to see how we get to what we eat today. If you go to a restaurant that tells you, I'm going to serve you a medieval dinner, there are two possibilities. Either it's not a medieval dinner and they're adjusting it to your palate, or it's disgusting.
Well, wait, it had to taste good, otherwise no one would come.
Depends on what is good.
There's
Yeah.
sugar
It's
alcohol.
it's the idea of what is good that changes over the centuries. The palate changes. Our ability to perceive flavors really increases over the centuries. It's, I guess, part of the evolution of the species. But if today we can distinguish, I don't know, two different vintages of the same wine, that means that our palate is extremely refined in picking up nuances. In this case, these are punches of flavor that keep hitting your palate and your taste buds, not with the kind of nuance that we would have today. I'll show you another recipe also from Maestro Martino. This is another signature recipe for Maestro Martino, which I think embodies the flavor of the food of the Renaissance. Pigeons and meats, let's say, almonds, egg yolk, it's a stew, okay? Egg yolk, vinegar, broth, spices, ginger, plenty of cinnamon, and plenty of sugar. So what we expect from this is sweet and sour. Sweet and sour was the note typical of the cuisine of these times. Notice, however, how Maestro Martino uses plenty of sugar to sort of counterbalance the plenty of cinnamon, and then there is vinegar and broth that create the sourness, but also dilute the sauce, and the almonds and the toasted bread that are binders, that create the creaminess instead.
What is mirauste?
Mirauste is, so historians consider it a derivation from migraust. Too bad that Suleiman is not here today, because it's an Arab term to indicate this dish. Catalan really in Italian cookbooks means Middle Eastern, because it's the influence that the Middle Eastern cuisine has on European cuisine through Spain, Catalonia, and then through across the Mediterranean into Italy. There's a number of Catalan recipes in these cookbooks that really refer to have all Middle Eastern. I mean, almonds, raisins. These are all typically Middle Eastern.
And is that because it was part of, like, so many parts of Italy were part of the Kingdom of Aragon? Is that the reason?
That is in part for that reason, but it's also because of the trade exchanges, so people traveling. Consider cuisine is an international language, so the influence, the cultural influence between different cuisines is much more direct than it is from the point of view of linguistic exchange. There is a hybridization that happens naturally, especially in Sicily, in Sardinia. Sardinia's Catalan is still spoken today, so that was the bridge from Catalonia into Italy across the island of Sardinia. What am I showing you here? Oh, you've read these things in Sydney Mints. So the center of the Mediterranean is where really sugar develops around the 10th century, and where it enters the Italian tradition. It was used as a spice or a medicinal. It was white, so it was actually very good for whitening your teeth. Sugar.
Before I rotted them out.
Yeah.
Then they were black.
It was very
It's very
expensive.
temporary.
Very expensive, so it was an expression or a sign of wealth and privilege. And obviously, Maestro Martino embraces the use of sugar, but he does it in a very interesting way, especially in comparison with what will happen after. For instance, in this other recipe for a pie in a saucepan, notice how he uses few raisins, a little onion chopped small and fried, and verjuice. Verjuice is the juice of sour grapes or unripened grapes. Okay, so it's still sweet and sour. It's not going to be as sour as vinegar, but and it's paired not with sugar but with raisins. And for all of us who know what cooking an onion means or frying an onion, there's sweetness that comes out from it. So before we had a lot of sugar and vinegar. In this case, he's toning it down to obtain a different shade of sweet and sour. Same thing happens here. This broth in a pie where he says to mix some well-pounded almonds with egg yolk, saffron, rich broth, and a bit of verjuice, well flavored with ginger and slightly with pepper. I'm very interested in these adverbs, quantifiers that he uses. In this case, he has 2 ounces of whole raisins, half a pound of sugar, cinnamon, ginger, a little saffron. Where's the sour here? Then he adds more sugar at the end and rose water. So more on the sweet side.
When you use ounces and pounds here, are they?
I don't think that they correspond exactly to our measurements.
The words?
The words are the same. Yeah. Yes. I'll try to go quicker through these recipes.
So I think people want to talk a little at the end, so let's.
Yeah, I'll just get to the end. These two fritters use a lot of sugar, but I wanted to show you this one because the fig fritters don't use any sugar because they're sweet already. So they have dried figs and raisins, but the fritters with bitter herbs have honey and sugar. It doubles up on the sweetness to counterbalance the bitterness of the herbs. I want to compare that with this recipe from Bartolomeo's copy a century later. Things have changed. The 16th century is really when the tipping point of the sugar commerce happens. There is more sugar available, but it's still very valuable. So the use of sugar as status symbol is still there, but there is more sugar that is available on the market. This is the first occurrence of the term pizza, okay, in any cookery book. Very different from what Pizzeria Paradiso makes today.
Ladies' lips.
Yes. You know why it's called ladies' lips? No, because when you taste it, you go, mmm. No, that's where the name comes from. So it uses 4 ounces. Look at the ingredients. Doves, half roasted on a spit, 3 boiled doves, dates, 8 ounces of marzipan paste, which is almond and sugar, almonds, 4 ounces of fine sugar, 4 more ounces of fine sugar, egg yolks, sugar, butter, rose water, salt, melted sugar, mostaccioli, which are sweet cookies. So what happens with scappi is that everything is cooked with sugar. Everything is super sweet. There's sugar in the ingredients and sugar on top because it needs to be visible. It needs to, to be crunchy under your teeth. And if this is not enough, look at the last 2 lines of the recipe. And if you wanted to have a bit of sweetness, put in a little malmsey, orange juice, and more sugar. So it really tells us how their palate perceived flavors. The other one was not sweet yet. Now it's a bit sweet.
A little bit of sweetness.
Yes.
The other thing I noticed about this recipe is that practically everything in it, the doves, the almonds, the sugar itself, everything in here is associated with Venus, with the goddess Venus. So Ladies' Lips Pizza does not surprise me at all. Rose water.
Of course.
Roses for Venus.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I never thought about that.
Roberto? I'm curious about, I am at least accustomed to thinking that we eat way too much sugar, right? And that there are huge public health implications of our eating way too much sugar. So do you know anything about what was happening to the health of these people? Were their teeth falling out?
The teeth were falling out. Most of their food was pounded, for instance, and passed through a sieve. So they ate a lot of
There you go.
porridge-like
Oh,
things.
really?
I guess because they couldn't chew much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The teeth would go.
Wow.
That is the immediate consequence of it.
Yeah.
But from a health perspective, yes, it was disastrous. And if you put it together with the huge amount of meat and proteins they ate, which brought gout, that was
Right.
their disease.
Like
no.
Bernie Sanders.
Bernie has gout. Yeah, people have gout. It's not like super
So, but-
uncommon.
Yeah, it's known.
You see,
Huh?
Yeah.
corpulent bodies in pictures and that, can't that be traced to the growth of sugar in the?
I
That's
believe
a sign
it's-
of wealth.
if
That's
not,
a sign of
I don't know if
wealth.
Sign of
only-
wealth, yeah.
Well, but think of Henry VIII, who by the end of his life, he couldn't walk.
Sitting there, right? Was he one of those two guys up there? In
His
the
brother
original,
giving him
when
all
you were
the
showing
coins.
the cut, the picture from.
Oh, yeah, well, but those were actors.
Yeah, but no, they didn't know. I don't have They didn't portray him as fat.
They were young.
It was very young.
is
In
very
at that stage, it was very young. Yeah. It's towards the end of his life that he
I knew that
developed.
wasn't.
This is a menu from Scappi. The menu starts here. Every part that I circled involves sugar or a sweet ingredient, inside and outside, on the serving of the plate. So we have 135. So all of these are sweet. The refrain here, if you read it in Italian, is con zucchero sopra, with sugar on top. Okay, every second line you have this refrain with sugar on top, with sugar on top. 135 sweet dishes in this page, 125 here, 162 here, 140. This is the same meal. 162, 180.
My gosh.
Okay, so these are the number of dishes that were served at this banquet. Okay, and this was not exceptionally big.
How long did it take?
Yeah.
Days.
Oh, days, oh, okay.
Sometimes there were
No, I mean, you eat
celebrations.
it.
There were days. Yeah. No, there were celebrations. There were 3 days of
3 days,
celebrations
okay.
for the wedding of the daughter of someone.
Okay.
So really, with Scappi, there's the final triumph of sugar, and sweet and sour still is the dominating flavor of the Italian Renaissance. Things change in 1742, when enough is enough.
Nobody has any teeth.
And the French chef called Menon introduces the concept of nouvelle cuisine. 1739 is when he publishes this treaty in which everything is erased. We'll do all the opposite that the Italians were doing. That is simplicity, first of all, so preserving the taste and the texture of the ingredients. Cream-based sauces as opposed to sweet and sour, and of the predominant sweet taste, and the limitation of sugar towards the end. It's the beginning of the concept of dessert. This is the beginning of modern cuisine. Some cooks in Italy started adapting that model to the Italian tradition. There would be a lot to say about Vincenzo Corrado and Francesco Leonardi, but really what they do is introducing fresh herbs, lemon juice instead of spices, and adjusting to the French model. These are the ingredients as they develop through the centuries, going from stronger to more delicate. We know all these things. Oh. No, you should be very critical of what I'm saying right now. You should really get mad at me because I'm missing something.
Well, I'm really curious, like, one thing I'm trying to figure out, and I'm not critical of you, and I don't know what you're missing. It's supposed to be a puzzle, I don't think I'm gonna solve it, but, so minces argument for sugar and the expansion of sugar, particularly in Britain, is about sort of satiating workers' appetite so they can work longer. So I'm wondering then, is it because in the period that you're talking about, it's still not as widely available, that
Yeah.
it's a kind of a gustatory pleasure for a few people, so it's not about...
It's not about nourishment.
Yeah,
No,
well,
it's
and
still
it's-
a spice, a very precious, costly spice. In fact, that's where I was heading.
Oh, okay. well,
Before Dominique gets too giggly about the French cuisine changing the fate of the Western world. Really, this could happen only because by the mid 18th century, sugar doesn't carry that status symbol that it used to carry, because the overproduction of sugar in the Caribbean, the price drops, and it becomes the prerogative of the middle class as opposed to the upper class, who immediately, instantly loses interest in it because it's not expensive anymore.
Right.
That's what happens. This shift in taste, in the perception of taste, and that's what I'm interested in. The social dynamics that determine the change of taste, not a decision or a stroke of genius of some sort. Things were changing in the bigger picture.
So, but in the French, and I read like the Amy Trubek's book about haute cuisine, but that's all invented also from royal sort of families and professional cooks in those palaces who then come out and start cooking sort of in pubs and more public places. So I don't know where I'm going with this, but it's really interesting to me that you have two cuisines being developed from, I guess higher class, the elites, right? And then that filters down into...
That's where I was saying you should be critical about what I'm saying now, because I'm talking about what the upper crust was eating, the 1%, but that's not representative of what people really ate, the rest of the 99%. But we have documents about the upper classes because there are the cookbooks. There are no cookbooks for the lower classes because they couldn't read. So trying to find out what the other were eating is a lot more complicated. So we have to resort to other sources, not the cookbooks, but sometimes literature, other archival documents, but it's very spotty knowledge. I'll show you one of these documents here. It is the diary that the painter Jacopo da Pontormo wrote between 1554 and 1556. Obsessively, he wrote down every single thing that went through his throat for those 2 years. It's invaluable for scholars of this history of gastronomy.
Do we know why?
Oh, yes,
Do we know why he wrote it?
Huh?
Do we know why?
Well, apparently it was obsessive compulsive.
Oh, I thought he was on a diet. I thought he was on a diet.
Yeah.
No.
His cutting points.
Bread, no dinner.
This is a sample. It was cleansing. They did that a lot. If you look at what he was eating, this is just a small sample, but it's representative of the entire 2 years. He was basically eating what we eat today: chicken, eggs, cheese, bread, wine. There is only
A lot of salad.
Yeah,
lot of salad, lot of
Salad and
The
apples. Apples
Mediterranean
and
diets.
bread.
The Mediterranean diets. There is only one mention over 2.5 years of sugar in this entry here, and there's no really fanfare going with it. So what this tells me is that if you were not part of that social dynamic of showing off and having to advance socially and politically, you were not really interested in sugar. First of all, you couldn't afford it. But really, even when you could, like in this case, because Jacopo da Pontormo was not poor, he was a master painter. So it was, we could say, middle class. So he could afford to go to the market, but he didn't care about sugar. Same thing with this beautiful, beautiful document by Michelangelo Buonarroti. This is a shopping list that Michelangelo writes probably for a maid, a servant, And he puts little drawings next to it because probably she couldn't read, right? So we have, and all he eats is bread rolls, a jug of wine, herrings, tortelli, salad, bread rolls again, a jug of full-bodied wine, and so forth. Spinach, yeah.
Fennel.
No sugar, very simple diet like we would eat today, very similar to
And
what.
probably bread baked without any sweetener.
There is no sweetener in bread in Italy. That's the thing, even today. You know, we use it here, but there is no such a thing unless it is a bread that is made on purpose, either to be used as part of a dessert or for breakfast. But it's very, very rare. It's more like a cake than a bread. In fact, Tuscan bread doesn't even have salt.
Yes.
So this confirms that there was another cuisine, a bigger group of people who ate in a different way. It's just a karsic river that doesn't surface because it's not written, it's not codified. So contemporary cuisine derives from this model, not from that of the upper classes. That of the upper classes was only the result of those social dynamics, was not because people liked to eat that way. Okay? But at the same time, over the centuries, the palate got used to it. So sweet was good for them. But if you were not part of that group, you were not interested. Now you could say maybe just because they couldn't afford it. So we can look at another kind of sources, which is literature, sort of the lowbrow literature that is known as the literature of the land of plenty, the literature of cocaine, which is, think of Rabelais in French literature. So these sort of dreams of starving people dreaming of dying by indigestion and long lists of food that they would want to have access to. Now, those are not really available in English, but in all the sources that I've looked at, sugar is hardly mentioned. Sweet ingredients are hardly mentioned. What they want is ducks, chickens, sausages, wine, all savory things. Sugar. So my point is, if dreaming is for free and I want to dream of sugar, nobody prevents me from doing it. So if sugar and sweets were not part of these pieces of literature, then they really didn't care for it. The most famous of them is in this novella by Giovanni Boccaccio, who is sort of the prose side of Italian medieval literature, where Dante would be the poetry side, who talks about this district called Bengodi. And there they bind their vines with sausages. And on a mountain, all of grated Parmesan cheese, dwell folks that do not but else but make macaroni and ravioli and boil them in capons broth, and then they throw them down to be scrambled for. And hard by flows a rivulet of vernaccia. So this becomes an iconic image that we find in all those other works that I.
Is this where on top of spaghetti comes from?
Probably, yeah. So this is a representation of that image that we find elsewhere.
Other than grapes and raisins, there are no fruits that were appear in these things? I didn't see any fruits
There were
in
apples.
there. Apples appeared?
In which?
Some of them I saw apples.
Where?
In the earlier recipes?
No, there was plenty of fruits. A lot, there was dry fruit, a lot of dry fruit.
Okay,
The fruit was very high in the scale of what was desirable and expensive, because it's very fragile crop. It's very exposed. So it was rare and very expensive to get. Pears were considered though.
That was my question, really. So if sugar was no longer the status symbol that it had been, did fruit take its place? What took its place? Did anything take its place?
Chocolate?
No, not really. What took its place in the 18th century is, I guess, meat is what kept its value. that's the first things that comes to my mind.
I was just thinking about, so I have a friend who brought some maple syrup to Indonesia as a gift at some point, and gave it to the people she was staying with, and they tried it and said, "This is intensely spicy. It's terrible. I hate it." Not too sweet, too spicy.
Too spicy.
And their palate just wasn't
Yeah.
attuned to it, right? And that was also making me think about how, maybe a working class population would think that escargot is disgusting, or maybe you might say that caviar is just gross. That's what the upper class eats, but they don't know any better. And I wonder if there wasn't that same
So
kind
the
of
dynamic
between the lower
beco-
classes and upper classes.
The dynamic between upper classes and lower classes is that of imitation, and it's still like that today. So the lower classes would want to eat what the upper classes eat in order to sort of join that club or feel that they're joining that club. So all the special meals that we think of are modeled on these upper class models. So at least one day you can feel like you are from that group, social group. Also, there is myriads of recipes that are mock recipes of the upper classes. I can give you examples of recipes made with anchovies that in the Mediterranean are the poor people's fish. There are plenty available to everybody, and they're cooked like the upper classes would cook birds. Same recipe, and even their name is fake birds for the poor people. In my modest opinion, we don't understand history of food if we don't understand hunger. All the names, the dynamics, the desires, the recipes are based on the reaction to appetite, to an ancestral need for food, and the desire to obtain it. That contrast, everything we do, we should have about food, we should have in the background the concept of lack of food. The idea of a banquet or a feast is to celebrate the absence of food. I mean, we've talked about whole birds brought to the table, sweet and sour, and carving the birds. Does this bring you to anything that we still do today? It's Thanksgiving. The bird is brought to the table whole, is carved at the table by the alpha male, who probably has never handled a knife in his life, and is butchering the bird with an electric knife from the 1970s, and is being served stuffed. Did I offend anybody?
We all can make a mental image there.
Right?
It's Paul's getting
It's stuffed. It is stuffed, and it's served with cranberry sauce, which is sweet and sour. Right? So there are memories of that tradition, even in the middle class and the lower class, but we perceive them as an exception to our daily food. So sweet is still part of our diet, of our palate, but we kind of adjust to it for Thanksgiving Day, then just give me a ham sandwich the day after. Okay.
Leftover.
Leftover turkey, yeah. I can stop anytime. I'll show you this picture. This is the guy who actually codifies the lower classes or the middle class cuisine in Italy, drawing on that unwritten tradition and turns it into The Science in the Kitchen and the Art of Eating Well. It's the only book that has had more copies sold and translations made than Pinocchio. He wrote 14 editions, he published 14 editions of this book during his lifetime, and millions of these volumes have been sold throughout the world. This is really the founding father of Italian cuisine as we know it today. And in this book there are only 4 recipes, aside from the dessert. only 4 recipes where sweet and sour is still used. There's somehow, boar. You don't eat boar every day. It's going to be a special thing to do, or veal tongue and so forth. Those are special recipes, sort of memories of the past, of which he's perfectly aware because he knew all the books that I quoted before from the 14th and 15th century. But obviously says, I'm not going to go there. Whatever inspiration I get from those books, I'm going to adjust it to our palate today. Because he says something that is very true. Gastronomy or cuisine is the only art that over the centuries knows an upward trend in terms of quality. It only improves. We always eat better than the generation before, until fast food comes around. Okay, and there is no...
You went too far.
That's what I wanted to do.
Oh, okay, you want to do that.
And there is no soda tax or ban on sugar that is going to be effective. It's really a cultural thing. It's about trends that take centuries to develop, but it's also about exposure to different foods. The overuse of sugar, even in things that we buy where we don't expect to find sugar, and if you look at the back label of a lot of the things that we buy from the supermarket, we'll have sugar or corn syrup in it, just because we're getting addicted to it. So in order to like those chips, which should be salty, in reality they add sugar to them. Bread should be sweet. It's everywhere. Okay, so it is more important to change the palate of people than putting taxes on the use of sugary drinks, in my opinion. And how you do that? By being exposed to a completely different kind of food. The trend that we have seen is towards foods that are not based on strong contrasts, like sweet and sour, hot, spicy, and so forth, but rather appreciating the nuances. If we had time, but we won't have time to go into modern Italian cuisine, we'll see that it is much more bland than what we would imagine. But simply because our palates are more trained to appreciate those more delicate flavors. Every once in a while, comfort food is okay. Ketchup is sweet and sour. It's vinegar and sugar. It's a reminiscence of that period. But it's turned into junk food that especially younger generations are addicted to.
Love me some ketchup.
Love me some ketchup.
Reagan tried to define it as a vegetable when they're.
That's right.
Never that school lunches. I have a question. How does the idea of, and which seems to be very popular in Italian and other cuisines, mama's cooking, the simplicities of the home cooking fit in with the idea of sort of the sophistication of the palate, and the use of ingredients that are maybe exotic or something like that? Is that a more recent trend?
This is my next slide, actually.
Okay.
That idea of traditional, home-cooked, local, regional is what slow food built its success on. Okay, and this happened at the time when the Italians were beginning to buy frozen meals, packaged food, is the economic
What's wrong with that?
Huh?
That's what we do here.
Well, they were departing from that tradition. Just because after World War II there was more money, more employment, being modern meant, especially for women, meant not to cook at home, not to be the maid for the family, but having a job and therefore not having time to cook. So this slow food basically was a reaction to that, and that's what it tried to sort of limit in that turn that Italian middle class was taking.
Yeah, it's not just Italian. I mean, lots of places say, like with good old home cooking type.
Not everywhere, not necessarily. My dream food when I was a teenager was something that was called sofficini. was a frozen pocket of, I don't know what kind of dough with I don't know what kind of processed cheese in it, which you would refry and eat. And it was salty, it was fat,
Salt
it
and
was,
fat, yeah.
you know, it was comfort food, and I loved it.
Yeah.
Luckily, I didn't get it very often because, you know, my parents were much, you know, were probably from 2 generations between me and them, and they never, you know, changed their habits. Yes?
It seems like in your description of the elite using food as a display of opulence runs parallel to maybe a lower class that, like, if when they're eating it's comfort food, and that I wanted to say it evolved to be different now, but it seems like now we appreciate good cooking, but what I love about food is the communal,
Of
social
course.
aspect, but there's still, you know, the Michelin star set price restaurants, and it's still opulence, and it's still like, how intensely strange can something be as a display?
That takes me to the next set. I'm not kidding, but oh no, that's another part that I wanted to show you. But yes, how do you justify the price tag of? Hold on.
Like, it makes me think of
Of
the
this
Alina.
dish by
Yeah, tell
Massimo
us.
Bottura.